I want you to picture like the single biggest oil shock in recorded history.
Right.
It just happened suddenly. Panic is rippling through the financial markets, supply chains are instantly fracturing, and governments are just scrambling to declare energy emergencies.
Yeah, it's a nightmare scenario.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, if you are a major resource-hungry superpower watching all of this unfold, how do you react? I mean, the typical playbook says you posture, right? You deploy naval fleets, you issue these aggressive public ultimatums, maybe you even join the fray yourself.
You definitely expect some kind of show of force.
Right. But what if instead you responded with supply chain optimization?
Yeah, just spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets
Yeah.
and absolute unshakable patience.
It completely defies, our traditional expectations of geopolitics. Because we are so conditioned to look for shock and awe, and instead we get this masterclass in quiet bureaucratic calculus.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are unpacking a really eye-opening and honestly sort of chilling analysis from April 2026. It's a paper by Dr. Farid Novin, and it's titled Dominant Strategies in an Uncertain Persian Gulf.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. Now, right off the bat, I want to be entirely transparent with you, our listener. Dr. Novin's paper centers on the very recent, highly politically charged events of the 2026 U.S.-Iran war.
Right.
And because this involves military actions by the United States, Israel, and Iran, I want to make our mission here today crystal clear. We are going to strictly and impartially report the events and the analysis exactly as they appear in the source material.
Exactly.
We aren't taking any political sides today, and we aren't endorsing any specific viewpoints about the conflict itself. We are simply here to decode the underlying mechanics of what happened behind the scenes.
And that neutral framing is so vital, really, because the story Dr. Novin is telling goes way beyond the immediate conflict. It points to this foundational shift in how global power actually operates today.
Yeah, how so?
Well, in the 21st century, supremacy isn't just decided by who has the most advanced stealth bombers anymore. It's decided by who controls the underlying plumbing of the global economy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the paper lays out a very specific timeline of events, so maybe set the scene for us.
Right, so let's go to February 28, 2026. The U.S. and Israel launched what were officially designated as kinetic operations.
Under the code name Operation Epic Fury, right?
Yes, Operation Epic Fury against Iran.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, when we say kinetic operations, we aren't talking about like cyber attacks or financial sanctions.
No, not at all.
We mean active, physical military strikes, bombing.
Precisely. Actual warfare. And the retaliation was incredibly swift. By March 4, just days later, Iran formally closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow.
Yeah. And the International Energy Agency categorized the immediate fallout as literally the largest oil supply disruption in human history.
I mean, the numbers in the paper are staggering.
They really are. To put it in perspective, Persian Gulf oil production dropped by roughly 10 million barrels per day.
10 million.
Yeah. And the price of Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. The Philippines was actually forced into a national energy emergency.
Right, and in Europe, I think diesel prices doubled almost overnight.
Exactly. It was immediate and brutal.
Which brings up this massive glaring paradox that I just can't wrap my head around. Like, help me understand the logic here. China is the world's largest importer of oil, right?
Yes, by a wide margin.
So if someone suddenly chokes off 20% of the world's seaborne crude, how does that not instantly tank their economy? Like, why wasn't Beijing loudly denouncing the U.S. or sending aircraft carriers to force the strait open?
Well, you would naturally assume they'd hit the panic button. But Dr. Novin introduces this concept he calls structured restraint.
Structured restraint.
Right. Beijing's reaction wasn't some opportunistic victory lap just because they saw a rival getting bogged down in the Middle East. It was actually driven by profound strategic anxiety.
Wait, anxiety? That is really not a word you usually associate with their foreign policy.
I know, but it is in this context. The leadership in Beijing viewed the closure of Hormuz not as a win, but as a systemic existential risk.
Interesting.
Here's the delicate tightrope they're walking. Yes, they absolutely benefit politically when U.S. global influence wanes. But they completely rely on the global trading order functioning smoothly just to survive.
Ah, I see.
They might want a distracted United States, but they desperately need a stable world. A world where shipping lanes are literally mined and oil costs a fortune is Beijing's worst nightmare.
So how do they navigate that tension? Like, if you're listening to this and wondering why China didn't just pick a side, what was their actual play?
They stepped into the role of the hyperneutral mediator.
Right.
While Western forces were engaged kinetically, China just went into diplomatic overdrive.
Right.
Their foreign minister, Wang Yi, he logged 26 separate ministerial phone calls in just 6 weeks.
26 calls.
Yeah. They sent special envoys touring all over the Middle East. They even partnered with Pakistan to issue this 5-point peace plan demanding a ceasefire.
It kind of feels like they were trying to project this aura of, look at us, we are the responsible adults in the room.
That's the exact narrative they wanted to build. By maintaining that formal neutrality, they essentially forced the United States to absorb all the negative PR, all the reputational damage, and the massive financial costs of the conflict.
While they just stay clean.
Exactly. While China positioned itself to the rest of the world as the sole defender of economic stability.
Okay, I hear you, but that sounds like a massive gamble. Because playing peacemaker is great PR, obviously, but diplomatic phone calls don't run factories.
No, they don't.
And 5-point peace plans definitely don't fuel airplanes. If they need that oil so badly, how did they physically keep their economy running while the strait was closed?
Because they saw this coming. Over the previous decade, they quietly built 3 massive layers of defense.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, they ruthlessly diversified how they get their energy. They didn't just rely on the Persian Gulf anymore.
Right, they looked elsewhere.
Yeah, they expanded their overland pipeline networks with Russia, especially after the 2022 sanctions kind of isolated Moscow. And they secured maritime routes from West Africa that travel all the way around the Cape of Good Hope.
Just completely bypassing the Middle East entirely.
Exactly.
Okay, so they built this geographic hedge. What was the second layer?
The second layer is a combination of massive strategic petroleum reserves
Right.
and something called the teapot refinery network.
Teapot refineries?
Yeah. So unlike massive state-run facilities that rely on these really rigid long-term contracts for specific types of crude oil, these teapot refineries are smaller, they're independent, and they are incredibly flexible.
Oh, I see.
They can process basically whatever distressed, discounted, or heavy crude is floating around the open market.
That makes total sense. It's like if your neighborhood's power grid goes down,
Yeah.
right? Your neighbor's super fancy smart home goes completely dark because it only runs on a specific grid connection. But you have this rugged, kind of dirty backup generator in your garage that can run on whatever scrap fuel you happen to have lying around.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And they paired that flexibility with immediate domestic rationing. They restricted exports of fertilizers and fuels just to keep it all in-house.
Wow.
But the third layer defense, this is the most fascinating part, and it relies on what Dr. Novin calls maritime passage asymmetry.
Okay, yes. I read this part of the paper, and I literally had to do a double take.
Are you saying the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC,
Yep.
was actively mining the strait and attacking ships, but intentionally letting Chinese vessels pass through?
Implicitly or explicitly, yeah. The data shows that certain petroleum tankers that were bound for China and India were allowed to transit the closed strait completely unharmed.
How does that even work in a war zone?
It just comes down to basic leverage. Iran knew that completely cutting off Beijing didn't serve Tehran's long-term survival.
Because they need them. Exactly. China was the only major buyer of their oil before the war, and alienating them would just be suicidal. That asymmetrical treatment was the ultimate dividend of Beijing refusing to take a side militarily.
The contrast there is just staggering to me because if you look at how Europe was doing at the exact same time, it was an absolute disaster.
Oh, complete chaos.
The paper notes that Qatar Energy, which supplies massive amounts of liquid natural gas, or LNG, they had to declare force majeure because of the missile threats.
Right, and we should probably clarify force majeure for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is essentially an act of God clause in a contract. When Qatar Energy invoked it, they were legally stating, circumstances entirely beyond our control make it impossible to deliver the gas we promised you.
So those contracts just vanished overnight.
Poof, gone.
Which is why Europe's energy prices spiked so violently.
And this is where the geopolitics turns into an absolute masterstroke for Beijing. What's fascinating here is that because Europe was highly dependent on that LNG and the global markets were in a chokehold, China basically walked out onto the world stage looking like a fortress.
Right.
Countries in the global south, meaning developing nations across Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, the optics were undeniable.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The U.S. was involved in a conflict that caused global energy poverty, while China's careful planning kept their own lights on.
But let's pause here for a second, because if you're a Western leader watching this and you suddenly realize that a single geopolitical choke point in the ocean can nearly collapse your entire energy grid,
Right.
doesn't that force you to completely rethink how you power your country?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The 2026 crisis became this violent accelerant for the global transition away from fossil fuels.
Okay.
But that realization plays perfectly into China's hand.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because you read the stats in Dr. Novin's paper, and they are wild.
They are.
Even before the war started, Chinese manufacturers controlled over 70% of the global electric vehicle battery market.
70%.
Just one company, CATL, was responsible for 42.1% of worldwide installations. They control 70% of global lithium refining, 85% of cobalt processing.
This is the core of what the paper terms supply chain sovereignty.
Supply chain sovereignty.
Yeah. China doesn't just assemble the final solar panel or the electric vehicle. They control the upstream mining and, critically, the midstream chemical processing.
So break that mechanism down for us. Why does the midstream processing matter so much? Like, can't the US or Europe just build their own battery factories in, I don't know, Ohio or Germany?
Well, you can build the factory, sure, but you still need the raw ingredients.
Mhm.
It's kind of like trying to bake a cake, but one person owns the only flour mill in town.
Ah.
You can build the absolute fanciest bakery you want,
So,
but if you don't control the refining process, taking raw, dirty lithium out of the ground and turning it into battery-grade chemicals, you are still entirely dependent. Right.
China spent 20 years subsidizing this deeply unglamorous, highly toxic refining industry.
So the irony here is just massive. I mean, think about the chain of events. The West gets involved in a military action in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It triggers a historic oil shock.
Right.
And if you're listening to this and wondering why your heating bill tripled, it's because of that shock. So the West looks at this and says, okay, we have to get off fossil fuels right now. We need wind turbines, solar fields, and EVs immediately to survive.
Exactly.
But to build that green grid, they are forced to buy the components from Chinese supply chains.
It's incredible. The war took a dangerous geopolitical crisis and transformed it into the greatest commercial windfall in modern history for Beijing.
Wow.
Europe started frantically fast-tracking permits for domestic renewable energy. But every single time a European country demanded another gigawatt of battery storage to replace natural gas, that purchase order inevitably flowed back to a manufacturer that was heavily influenced by Beijing. So they don't even have to coerce you into buying their technology. The realities of the geopolitical environment just do it for them.
That is systemic power at its finest. However, this does create a new vulnerability for them.
Okay, what's that?
If you dominate the physical hardware of the future, how do you protect the money paying for it? How do you stop a rival from freezing your bank accounts?
Right, because if the United States decides to leverage the dollar against them the way they sanctioned Russia in 2022, all those batteries don't mean much.
Exactly.
And the paper gets into this, highlighting a major declaration by President Xi Jinping in February 2026. He actually made the internationalization of the renminbi, the Chinese currency, a top national security priority.
Yeah, they watched the West freeze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian sovereign reserves just because Russia operated inside a dollar-dominated system.
Right.
So Beijing drew a line in the sand. They accelerated their own alternative systems like the cross-border interbank payment system, and they pushed their digital yuan.
Wait, how does a digital yuan actually protect them from U.S. sanctions?
Well, the current global standard for moving money between countries is the SWIFT system, right?
Right, SWIFT.
Which is heavily influenced by the West. A digital yuan operates on a completely separate, closed-loop ledger. If two countries agree to trade in that digital currency, the transaction never touches a Western bank or the SWIFT network at all.
Oh, wow.
It is virtually impossible to sanction money you can't see or touch.
But let me ask a grounding question here, because I feel like I read an article about the quote-unquote death of the U.S. dollar every other week.
Constantly.
Is the dollar actually in danger of losing its crown, or is this just wishful thinking by Beijing to sound tough?
We definitely need a reality check here. The rhetoric is super loud, but the underlying data tells a very different story.
Okay.
Dr. Novin cites IMF figures from late 2025 showing that the Chinese yuan only accounted for about 1.93% of global foreign exchange reserves.
Wait, barely 2%? That's almost nothing.
Yeah. Compared to the US dollar, which hovers around 57%, it's minuscule.
So why is it so low if they're pushing it so hard?
The bottleneck is China's own economic policy. They maintain incredibly strict capital controls, meaning the government tightly restricts how much money can move in and out of the country, mainly to prevent capital flight.
Oh, so investors don't want to use it.
Exactly. Global investors demand deep, freely moving liquidity. Until China relinquishes that control, the yuan simply cannot replace the dollar.
Okay, so their financial shield is still very much a work in progress. What about their physical trade routes? Because the war heavily damaged the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
It was a massive blow, yes. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is their trillion-dollar vision to connect the world via physical infrastructure.
Right.
Iran was meant to be the golden bridge connecting Central Asia straight to the Persian Gulf. But when the bombs started falling, Chinese projects in Iran were suspended, and some were literally physically destroyed.
I imagine they couldn't just keep sending freight trains through an active war zone, so how did they adapt to that?
They executed a massive logistical pivot. They leaned heavily into what's called the Trans-Caspian Corridor.
How does that actually work mechanically?
It is incredibly complex. Instead of just a straight shot on a train through Iran, you load goods onto a train in western China, run it through Kazakhstan, offload everything onto a cargo ship to cross the Caspian Sea, reload it onto another train in Azerbaijan, and then push it into Europe.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It is clunky, it requires way more handling, and it's super expensive. But it avoids the conflict entirely. They also surged investments into the China-Pakistan economic corridor to maintain their access to the Arabian Sea.
But does that mean they're abandoning Iran? Because if I'm Tehran right now, I'd feel pretty left out in the cold.
They aren't abandoning Iran at all. They are just playing the long game.
Right.
I mean, think about what Iran looks like after a kinetic war.
Right.
Its infrastructure is shattered, its economy is crippled, and it is totally isolated from Western capital. Iran basically goes from being a negotiating partner to a captive market. They will be utterly desperate for someone, anyone, to rebuild their ports, their power grids, and their telecommunications.
And China is just standing there with a bottomless checkbook and a massive construction crew.
Exactly. Which transitions us perfectly to the most fascinating section of Dr. Noven's analysis, the game theoretic modeling for the rest of the decade.
Right. So if they are currently relying on clunky workarounds like that Trans-Caspian corridor, how does Beijing actually plan for the future? Because the Middle East isn't exactly famous for being predictable.
No, it's not. Dr. Noven applies a Bayesian game theoretic projection.
Okay, explain that for us.
In simple terms, a Bayesian model means you don't just guess what will happen. You assign probabilities to multiple different scenarios, and you constantly update the math as new actions occur in real time.
Got it.
The paper outlines 4 distinct pathways for how the region might evolve from 2026 to 2030.
Okay, walk us through those 4 scenarios.
The first is a protracted, low-level kinetic stalemate. Basically, no one wins, no one loses, the region just bleeds.
Grim. Okay.
The second is a U.S.-led diplomatic breakthrough. But the model gives this a very low probability, given that Iran outright rejected a 15-point U.S. peace framework during the conflict.
Right, that ship has sailed.
The third is a worst-case scenario, wider regional contagion where the war just drags in neighboring Gulf states.
And the fourth?
The fourth is what the model identifies as the most likely outcome. It carries a 38% probability. It's called the technocratic reconstruction pathway.
Technocratic reconstruction.
Right. In this scenario, the heavy fighting subsides, and China systematically swoops in to rebuild the country, securing long-term leases on deep-water ports and just generally locking the Iranian economy into their ecosystem.
So what does this all mean? Like, if the peace negotiations keep falling apart, how can Beijing be so confident betting on that reconstruction pathway?
Because of a concept in game theory known as a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy isn't about perfectly predicting what your opponent will do. It is about choosing a move that guarantees you a positive outcome, regardless of what the other player does.
So, heads they win, tails they win.
That's the reality. By maintaining strict neutrality, accelerating their monopoly on clean technology, and keeping vast pools of capital ready for reconstruction, China benefits in almost every scenario.
Wow.
If peace breaks out, they get the building contracts. If the war grinds on, their clean tech dominance grows as the rest of the world panics over oil. They don't need to win a war. They just need to win the peace.
The paper makes a really sharp observation about the United States in this context, too, because the U.S. has unrivaled innovation, right? Look at AI, biotech, the sheer depth of American capital markets.
Absolutely.
But Dr. Novin argues that America suffers from a credibility deficit.
Yeah, and that's because American foreign policy can swing wildly depending on which administration is in power.
Right.
When your policies shift every 4 years, or when your military actions trigger historic economic pain for your own allies, those allies start hedging their bets. They start prioritizing reliability over ideology.
Which makes sense.
China's entire geopolitical brand is built to fill that credibility deficit. They offer boring, predictable continuity right when the U.S. is delivering disruption.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about Bayesian models and teapot refineries and all this geopolitical maneuvering?
Right, it can sound very abstract.
Exactly, but it's not. Because the events of 2026 prove that global supremacy isn't decided on a battlefield anymore. The price of the food at your grocery store, the type of car you'll be driving in 5 years, the stability of your local power grid, all of that is being dictated right now by these invisible underlying supply chain wars.
Yep.
While the world was totally fixated on missiles and blockades, China's strategy was simply to be the indispensable builder.
It leaves us with a truly vital question, though, something to really consider as we move into the 2030s.
Let's hear it.
China's entire strategy, this structural dominance, relies on the fact that no one else can manufacture and build physical things at their scale.
Right.
But what happens when the technological innovations the West is pioneering right now truly mature? I'm talking about advanced artificial intelligence pairing with localized automated 3D manufacturing.
Oh, I see where you're going. You mean when a country doesn't need to buy a solar panel shipped from across the world because an AI-driven factory can just print it in their own backyard?
Precisely. If the ability to build complex technology becomes democratized and localized, does China's massive supply chain advantage suddenly evaporate? Could the very tech boom we are living through right now eventually render this entire structural monopoly obsolete?
That is a wild thought to leave on. If the future of manufacturing flips from global to local, the entire geopolitical chessboard resets overnight.
It really does.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking those big questions. Keep looking past the chaotic headlines. And remember, sometimes the most devastating move you can make in a crisis is simply sitting back with a spreadsheet and waiting for the dust to settle.